Hello, I'm Thuan Tinh, or you can call me Sophia, and I'm from the National University of Singapore. My poster is number MT196 under the Neurodevelopmental Disorders category. Today, I'm honored to present to you this work titled Variations in Functional Gradients Relate to Dimensions of Psychopathology in Preschool Children. As you all know, young children can suffer from mental health symptoms. While the big age of onset for having any mental health disorders is 14 years, first onset of mental disorders can happen as early as 5 years of age. However, little has been done to study the psychiatric risk and the associated imaging phenotypes in preschool children. There is also a high comorbidity problem that confounds the field of study. Talking about ADHD as an example, 67% of kids with ADHD have at least one co-occurring disorders. Therefore, there has also been great interest in defining and characterizing the underlying features across disorders instead of looking at each of them separately. There are studies attempting to link disorders and functional brain patterns in children. The idea that there were both common and dissociable markers associated with dimensions of psychopathology has been reiterated in many literatures, where we saw a common overarching general psychopathology factors shared between all disorders, as well as different connectivity patterns associated with different dimensions such as externalizing, internalizing, mood, fear, etc. As these studies have mainly focused on children from age from 9 to adolescence, therefore, it would be helpful to look at how these neuroimaging markers for psychopathology might manifest in preschool children. So aside from directly looking at functional connectivity pattern between networks, there has been a rising interest in studying cortical organization as continuous gradients. Using gradients, spatial variation across the cortex is examined continuously along overlapping organizing axes. Areas that have similar gradient values have a similar connectivity patterns. Previous studies have shown that the principal gradient that explain the most spatial variation in human display a sensory-motor to transmodal organization. Multimodal networks such as default mode and control lie in one end of the spectrum, while the somatomotor and visual network, the unimodal networks, lies in the opposite end. We observe the same pattern not only in functional connectivity, but also in various other domains such as intracortical myelin, semantic category processing, etc. The second gradient, on the other hand, separates the unimodal networks between the visual and somatomotor cortex. These patterns were, however, all obtained in cognitively healthy adults. So this paper, leveraging resting state fMRI scan from healthy individuals aged 6 to 17 years, we note that the transition from childhood to adolescence is reflected in the gradual maturation of the gradient patterns across the cortical sheet. In children, the order of the two gradients is flipped compared to adults. The overarching organizational gradient is anchored within the unimodal cortex, between the somatomotor and visual territories, and the second gradient separating the unimodal and transmodal regions. Conversely, in adolescence, the principal gradient of connectivity transitions into an adult-like framework, with a default mode network at the opposite end of the spectrum from primary sensory and motor regions. However, the gradient pattern in preschool children, the longitudinal changes in individuals' connectivity gradients, as well as whether variations of gradient patterns relate to psychopathology remains to be seen. In this study, we hypothesized that the principal organizing axis of cortical gradient lies in the unimodal network for preschool children. We expect that different networks would further segregate along the gradient between 4.5 and 6 years old. We also think that different mental health disorders would correlate with the network gradient patterns. In this project, we will be using the resting state fMRI scan from the Gusto dataset in Singapore. We'll then construct a functional connectivity matrix for each of the resting state scan for 4.5 and 6 years old children. We can then derive the gradient patterns and map them to 7 functional networks. From there, we can look at the gradient patterns at each time point and investigate the longitudinal changes in the connectivity gradients within the same individuals. We'll be using the currently available questionnaire data at 4.5 years old, which assesses a few common psychiatric diagnoses and correlate them with the gradient patterns using the multivariate partial least square approach. Now we'll move on to the results section. In this plot on the left, we have the principal gradient value plotted onto the brain surface. Here we can see the distribution of the gradient value as summarized in the network shown below. You can see that the gradient 1 separates the unimodal cortices, namely the visual and somatomotor regions. The two panels on the right here clearly demonstrate this, and it plots the gradients in Euclidean space. We can see that the blue regions corresponds to the somatomotor networks, and the green color in the visual network are on the opposite spectrum of the principal gradients. This confirms our hypothesis that the principal gradient in preschool children is anchored within the unimodal regions. For the second gradient, we can see that similar to the principal gradient in adult, this gradient separates the unimodal regions and the multimodal networks, with visual and somatomotor on one end and the default mode control networks on the other end. This is again demonstrated on the right, where we can see that the second gradient separates the blue and green regions and the red regions. The blue and green color correspond to the somatomotor network and the visual cortices, whereas the red color lies in the multimodal areas in the frontal and temporal regions. After identifying the gradients in 4 by 5 years old, we then look at the functional gradient organization at 6 years old. We can see that the organization of the network gradient is very similar across the two age groups. And looking at the 57 subjects that have scanned in both age groups, we carry out a paired t-test to see whether specific networks changes with age. And note that for gradient 1, the somatomotor and control network is different at 6 years old. However, this difference is small and does not withstand FDR correction. We then investigated individual correlations in the same 57 subjects and saw that the correlations are very high for the first two gradients. This means that the functional gradient organization is highly stable in this preschool age group, which lends credentials to the school of thought that the functional gradient is a stable trait. Therefore, it's even more meaningful to see how this functional state might change with respect to different mental health conditions. So we then carry out the partial least square correlation analysis to look at the pattern of gradient of 4 by 5 years old relating to mental health disorders. We discovered one latent variable linking the second gradient, separating the unimodal and transmodal networks with the mental health impairments. In the first plot, we noted that the three disorders were identified to be significantly correlated with this latent variable based on the bootstrapping. Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, ADHD, positively correlated with this latent variable, whereas social phobia and specific phobia exhibited a negative correlation with the same latent variable. Looking at the bootstrap ratio for each of the brain networks, multiple networks significantly contributed to the latent variable, with the region cluster of the unimodal areas being negatively associated with the latent variable and vice versa for the regions at the transmodal end. There was a positive correlation between the impairment and brain score. This showed that there was a diverging pattern of gradient distribution corresponding to different disorders. Looking at gradient patterns again, we can see that children with higher ADHD impairment scores exhibited a more diverged network gradient structure, where the multimodal and unimodal network are situated further away from each other. On the other hand, those with higher phobia score displayed the opposite pattern, where the networks are more clustered along these gradients. The dorsal attention network was identified to be the most reliable contributor to the latent variable. So to conclude, from our findings, we saw that the principal gradient in children is indeed anchored within the unimodal regions. We also observed how functional gradient organization is highly stable in preschool children. Looking at the link between functional gradients and psychopathology, we noted dissociable patterns of gradient variations corresponding to different mental health disorders, where the gradients separating the high and low neural networks at 4 by 5 years old display a diverging pattern across disorders. Our findings highlight the importance of studying functional network topography changes in children and how they might account for the severity of different mental health disorders. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank my supervisor, Prof. Helen Cho, for her guidance and support, as well as the lab member for all the advice and discussion we have had regarding this project. I would also like to thank our collaborators on the Gusto research team who have generously shared the dataset with us, without which the study would not be possible. Finally, thank you to all the audience members for your time and attention, and please approach me if you have any questions. Thank you very much for listening.